change, and that they were determined not to fight all of the imperialists at once, that they would look for divisions and contradictions within the capitalist, imperialist governments to make tacit or tactical alliances with some so as to prevent all of them uniting as one, as an imperialist united front against the Soviet Union. So Stalin's preference was clearly to unite with Britain and France, and in response, they told him no. So the reason I'm saying that is it's the context for the surprise announcement in 1939 that behind the scenes, when the Soviets were being rebuffed by the Western so-called democratic capitalists, German imperialism, Nazism had opened a door, a diplomatic door to the Soviets. And after a great deal of, sort of waiting, the Stalin leadership in the Soviet Union starts to allow that door to be opened. And secret negotiations are taking place. There's lots people can read about this. I think even Deutscher's book on Stalin, which is, I'm not endorsing the book, but I think his presentation on the evolution and the detailed evolution of Soviet-German negotiations and why eventually a non-aggression pact is signed by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, how that happens. E.H. Carr, by the way, has another important small volume called Soviet-German Relations, 1919 to 1939. E.H. Carr, British scholar. I would encourage people who want to know more about this to read that slender volume, but very, very useful. Anyway, it takes the world by surprise, certainly. And it takes a big part of the left by surprise because the left, since the 7th Congress, since 1935, has been promoting a united front against fascism. And the left, meaning the communist left, is also looking to Moscow as the center of the world communist movement, the center of the Communist International. And suddenly, without sort of, advance notice, the announcement comes that Germany and the Soviet Union are now in some sort of alliance, the non-aggression pact. And it has a very profound impact. In the United States, half of the members, maybe half of the Communist Party USA, who had been recruited during the anti-fascist period of 1935 to 39, they leave the party. They're like, what the heck? Parts of the Trotskyist movement desert the Fourth International too and say, oh, look, this proves the point that Stalin and Hitler are just twin despots. They're, tyrannical dictators. There's an equivalence. Anyway, this has been a point of controversy within the left for a long time. But I think you and I agree, Carlos, that from the point of view of what the Soviet Union was facing, the refusal of the Western democracies to come to their aid or to enter into a collective security, and refusal to allow all the imperialists to unite against them at the same time, even though it may not have been explained the way we would prefer it to be explained, it certainly, from a military point of view, was an understandable move.
Yes, absolutely. And 100%, it must have been incredibly confusing for people in North America and Western Europe. As you say, the international communist movement had been at the forefront of the struggle against fascism. The Soviet Union was the only major power to support the Spanish Republic against Franco. The international brigades were composed largely of communists. Incidentally, one of the people in charge of recruitment to the international brigades was a certain Josip Broz Tito, who would later, as you know, become leader of Yugoslavia. Communists were there in Cable Street in East London. Communists were there in Harlem. They were there in the Deep South fighting segregation, fighting lynching, fighting for civil and human rights for African Americans. So it's easy to understand how a military pact between the major socialist power and the major fascist power would be a source of incredible anguish and confusion. And, more or less as soon as the pact was signed by the end of August 1939, the Communist parties essentially gave up their leadership of the anti-fascist struggle. And when World War II broke out in Europe, in September 1939, they were framing it as an inter-imperialist war, much like World War I, and they were calling for revolutionary defeatism, much like the Bolsheviks had called for in World War I. So it was a total reversal of line. I mean, Harry Pollitt was forced to resign as General Secretary of the Communist Party of Great Britain because he supported the war against the Nazis. And this is perhaps the canonical example of the contradictions and the problems of the Comintern, because on the one hand, it's been set up to support socialist revolutionary struggle worldwide. On the other hand, it's considered by the capitalist world as a sort of arm of Soviet diplomacy. So in September 1939, the Soviets needed to demonstrate to Germany that they're committed to non-aggression. Otherwise, what's the point in a pact? But that's not a consideration that can easily be explained to the working class in London, Paris, or New York. So yes, the whole thing was handled badly, and I think it highlights some of the deep-rooted problems in the structure of the global communist movement. But also, it was a genuinely very difficult situation to manage, and there were a few things going on at the time. But yeah, as you've said, the Soviet Union was completely isolated and without a lot of choices available to it. They knew a war was coming. You can read their speeches and literature from the time. They understood the developing world political situation very well, much better, in fact, than the Western powers did. They understood the significance of the Great Depression. They understood the significance of the rise of fascism. And since the early 1930s, they've been pushing for an alliance with the capitalist democracies against German fascism, against German expansionism. You can read the memoirs of Maxim Litvinov, who was Soviet foreign minister for much of that time. You can read the memoirs of Ivan Maisky, who was the Soviet ambassador in London. And you can see that the Soviets were working relentlessly day and night to construct an alliance against Nazism. They joined the League of Nations in 1934. Lenin had referred to the League of Nations as a robber's den. They'd refused to join it, but they joined in 1934. They even talked about the importance of a strong League of Nations that would stand firm against aggression by one state against another, referring very obviously to the fascist countries. As late as September 1938, when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union offered to go to war to protect Czech independence, as long as France also honored its commitment to defend member states of the League of Nations. France, of course, refused. Even in March 1939, 6 months before the outbreak of war in Europe, the Soviets called for a joint conference with Britain, with France, with Romania, with Poland. And this was obviously, a last-ditch attempt, a final attempt to form a common security alliance. And the French and British just flat out refused. Ultimately, the Western powers had other ideas. Their policy of appeasement, of accepting and even encouraging German rearmament, of allowing German expansion, was meant to push Hitler eastwards to satisfy his demand for colonies with the territories of the Soviet Union, his much coveted Lebensraum. So, the Soviet Union was betrayed by Britain and France, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a last-minute deal to avoid a German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1939, when they needed more time to prepare for war. They got 22 months of respite that allowed them to double the size of their armed forces, to shift huge parts of their industrial base to the east, thousands of miles from the front, which meant that they were able to continue production, including weapons production, after the war started. So they used that time to upgrade and modernize their industry and their military equipment. And Stalin made a speech 11 or 12 days after Hitler invaded in June 1941. And he says, people might ask, have we been duped? How could the Soviet government have signed a non-aggression pact with perfidious people like Hitler and Ribbentrop? Well, we got an extra year and a half of peace, and that gave us the opportunity to prepare our forces. And ultimately, you have to say, as the saying goes, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, because the Soviets won the war, where France collapsed in days in the face of the Nazi war machine. Other countries didn't fare much better. With a bit of geographical help from the English Channel, Britain held an uneasy stalemate of sorts, but it certainly wasn't on the cusp of defeating Germany. The Soviets defeated the Nazis. Europe and Asia were liberated from fascism at incredible cost in terms of death, suffering, and destruction. But they won, and you can only shudder at the thought of what might have happened if they hadn't. Yes, we've had some terrible fallout in the global left as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but I strongly suspect that the fallout would have been infinitely worse had it not taken place.